Welcome to my video. Today we will cover the East African Campaign of World War II from South Africa's perspective. The East African Campaign of 1940 to 1943 was one of the first Allied victories of the war. It saw the British and their Commonwealth allies slowly wear down and defeat the numerically superior Italians in the border regions of Kenya and Sudan, and then later in Somalia, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. If this topic sounds interesting to you, then please keep watching. This video is on the East African Campaign, but its perspective is rooted in South Africa's history during World War II. In a previous video, I covered the first part of this history by exploring how a faction of Afrikaner nationalists, led by Prime Minister Hertzog, almost prevented South Africa from joining the war in 1939. However, Prime Minister Hertzog was forced to resign and was replaced by Jan Smuts on September 6, 1939. Prime Minister Smuts willingly joined the British war effort against Germany, and in this video we examine his subsequent actions that culminated in South Africa's considerable contributions to the East African Campaign. After Smuts became Prime Minister, much of his immediate attention was devoted to reorganizing the South African Army's 20,000-strong force, which was dispersed among 6 district commands throughout the country. While effective as a policing and garrison force within South Africa, this military was not prepared to fight outside the country's borders. Smuts began to prepare this force to fight the Axis anywhere on the African continent, moving the armed forces away from their garrison role. On September 22, 1939, he signed a policy paper that ordered the district commands to be reorganized and expanded into the 1st and 2nd South African Infantry Divisions, both of which would include about 20,000 fighting troops. While roughly 40,000 troops is still a small number for a country of millions to support, these divisions were just the tip of the iceberg. The South African Army also needed to build an entire logistical infrastructure capable of supporting these small fighting forces hundreds or even thousands of miles from home. Almost 100,000 of these support personnel were needed in roles such as transportation, shipping, navigation, military engineering, soldier training, equipment maintenance, and field hospital work. While a draft would have likely helped find personnel to fill these roles, Smuts did not issue one, as it would have increased the already considerable Afrikaner nationalist opposition to the war effort. Instead, Smuts relied solely on volunteers to fill the South African Army, causing consistent personnel issues throughout the war. These issues in finding volunteers were made worse by South Africa's discriminatory laws, which forbade all non-Europeans, who made up about 70 to 80% of the country's population, from fighting as soldiers in the South African Army. Instead, African volunteers were limited to support roles such as cooks, guards, transport drivers, supply depot staff, and medics in the Cape Corps. Later, in July of 1940, Smuts expanded the African role in the military, out of necessity, by founding the Native Military Corps. Despite this impressive name, Africans were still relegated to non-combat support roles, and even these limited attempts to include non-whites in the military were staunchly opposed by the Afrikaner nationalists, the same group who would later beat Smuts in the 1948 elections and go on to enact apartheid in South Africa. Smuts' refusal to enact a draft, combined with harsh restrictions on black South Africans' role in the military, meant that South Africa, a country of 10.1 million people in 1939, had only 334,000 active personnel during World War II. By comparison, the British Dominion of Canada, a country of 11 million people in 1939, had 1.1 million active duty military personnel during the war. Despite these political limitations on the number of troops South Africa could muster, Prime Minister Smuts did his best to expand, train, and procure equipment for the South African Army throughout the fall of 1939 and the winter of 1940. As the South African Army continued preparing for war, conflict on the African continent loomed as the domestic and foreign policies of fascist Italy and the German government drew closer every day. In the spring of 1940, the British and their Commonwealth allies began reinforcing the British colonies bordering Italian Libya and East Africa, fearing that Italy might join the war on the German side. In March of 1940, in correspondence with this policy, British General Wavell, the commander of all Commonwealth forces in North and East Africa, requested that Smuts transfer a South African force to Kenya. However, when this request was sent, both the 1st and 2nd South African Infantry Divisions were still procuring equipment and in the early stages of training volunteers. Because of this, all Smuts had available to send was the 1st South African Infantry Division's anti-air detachment, which arrived at the Kenyan harbor of Mombasa on June 1, 1940, ready to protect the port from any Italian bombing raid. Only 9 days after the South Africans arrived in Kenya, Italy joined World War II on Germany's side, just as the British politicians had feared. The next day, June 11, 1940, South Africa declared war on Italy. The same day, 4 Junkers Ju-86 bombers of the South African Air Force launched a bombing raid from the Wajir Air Base against Italian troops camped a few kilometers from the Kenyan city of Moyale. Soon after, the Italians responded with an air assault on the Wajir Air Base on the 13th. Over the next weeks, Italian troops advanced into British Kenya, Somaliland, and Sudan. When France surrendered to the Germans on June 22, 1940, the Italian commanders were emboldened and continued their advance at a rapid pace. In northwest Kenya, Italian irregulars crossed into Kenya from Italian Somaliland and Ethiopia, attacking the British garrison at Fort Harrington near the Kenyan city of Moyale. Back in South Africa, Smuts received each report of the Italian advances in East Africa and firmly believed that more substantial South African support to Kenya would turn the tide of the invasion. While both infantry divisions were still unprepared for combat, Smuts was able to mobilize a single brigade from Brigadier General George Brink's 1st South African Infantry Division. This particular brigade, led by Brigadier General Dan Pienaar, was chosen for deployment in Kenya since it was the most combat-ready unit in the army, composed of thoroughly trained pre-war citizen force regiments such as the Duke of Edinburgh's Own Rifles, the 1st Royal Natal Carabiners, and the 1st Transvaal Scottish. On July 13, 1940, Smuts gave a farewell speech to General Pienaar's 1st Brigade Group. Meanwhile, back in Kenya, the outnumbered defenders of Moyale and Fort Harrington were planning to retreat under the cover of darkness to avoid capture by the numerically superior Italian attackers. By July 15, 1940, all British in Fort Harrington and Moyale had either retreated or had been captured by the victorious Italian forces. 3 days later, on July 18th, Pienaar's 1st Brigade boarded the MS Dilwara, Devonshire, and Rajula in Durban Harbour, setting course for Mombasa, Kenya. While the South Africans sailed to Mombasa, the Italians had advanced 62 miles into Kenya, occupying the Kenyan towns of Bunda and Dabel. Here they halted their advance, since their supply lines were stretched to their limit, and they needed time to catch up to the Italian troops. While the Italian offensive paused in Kenya and progressed elsewhere, by mid-August the Italians captured British Somaliland, which greatly boosted morale and represented the greatest Italian victory over the British thus far in the war. As the Italians secured British Somaliland, Pienaar's brigade underwent regional training at Gilgil in central Kenya for most of August. Here, its members slowly adapted to life in the remote regions of Kenya, which drastically differed from their well-supplied military bases in South Africa. In the last week of August, the brigade completed its regional training. Soon after, Pienaar's brigade moved to the Wajir military base, the command center for the British defense of northeast Kenya. Near the start of September, The brigade's 1st Transvaal Scottish Regiment was placed under British command within the 2nd East African Brigade, where it was sent to guard the Liboy border post. Soon, this regiment and the 2nd East African Brigade defended against a powerful Italian attack on the village and were forced to retreat. This would be the first battle South African troops fought during the East African Campaign. For the rest of September 1940, the South Africans and British maintained a mainly defensive strategy against Italian incursions into Kenya. However, this strategy changed in October, when General Alan Cunningham became the commander-in-chief for all British forces in East Africa. Cunningham wanted to test Italian defenses by launching an attack against the captured Kenyan Somali settlement of El Wak to determine if a broader offensive should follow. He planned the attack for December 16, 1940, and placed General Pienaar's 1st South African Brigade under the command of Major General Goodwin Austen's 12th East African Division. In preparation for this coming battle, Pienaar's troops began intensive combat drills and field exercises throughout the remainder of October and all of November. As Pienaar's troops prepared for the attack, the remainder of the 1st South African Infantry Division, particularly General Brink's 2nd and 5th Infantry Brigades, arrived in Mombasa on November 11, 1940. However, these newly arrived troops would not participate in the attack, since they needed time to train and adjust to Kenya's unique climate. In early December, Pienaar's troops did their final training exercises before converging at Fort Wajir with the rest of the 12th East African Division. On December 14th, these forces left Fort Wajir, splitting into 2 detachments. One detachment moved directly toward El Wak, while the other moved east behind the Italian positions, intending to cut off Italian escape routes. On the morning of December 16, 1940, both groups were in position and the raid soon commenced. The fighting was ferocious but quick, and within an hour the Commonwealth's troops achieved their objectives, taking many Italians prisoner. Surprisingly, the South Africans discovered that El Wak was a regional Italian headquarters that contained many important documents on Italian troop positions in East Africa. By December 20th, Pienaar's South African troops and the rest of the 12th East African Division returned to their base at Fort Wajir, bringing the prisoners and newfound intelligence with them. Once British General Cunningham learned of their success, he authorized more attacks on the Italians in northern Kenya and Somalia to commence in January of 1941. Pienaar's South African 1st Brigade would continue operating under the 12th East African Division as it advanced into Italian Somalia. Meanwhile, General Brink's 2nd and 5th South African Brigades were tasked with securing the Chalbi Desert of northern Kenya and the Italian forts in the Gala Sidamo area of Italian East Africa. To accomplish this task, Brink's forces made their base in Marsabit. From this point, South African armored cars began scouting the southern parts of the Chalbi Desert, where they encountered no Italian resistance. Determined to find the enemy, General Brink led the 1st Natal Mounted Rifles, the No. 2 Armored Car Company, a contingent of Ethiopian irregulars, and the 12th South African Field Battery north toward the El Yibo and El Sardu waterholes around January 10, 1941. By January 15th, Brink's forces arrived at the El Yibo waterholes and began to attack the Italian colonial troops guarding them. The fighting lasted for 3 days, and the air support from the South African Air Force's Hawker Hart bombers proved decisive. By January 18th, the Italians retreated north into Ethiopia. The next day, South Africans took the El Sardu water wells without any resistance. Now that northern Kenya was secure, Brink's forces paused for about 2 weeks to regroup and resupply. They resumed their advance on January 31st, 1941, when the South Africans entered the Hobok region of Ethiopia. The next day, Brink's troops attacked Italian positions at Hobok's Goai crater and the village of El Gumu. In both battles, the South Africans had the upper hand, and by 4 p.m. the Italians had retreated from both positions, letting the South Africans take them. The next day, the 3rd Transvaal Scottish and the 2nd Armored Car Company attacked Fort Hobok, which they captured in the afternoon of February 2nd, 1941. However, the South African armored cars failed to apprehend the retreating Italians, who marched east toward the Italian defenses at Mega and Moale. General Brink soon turned his attention toward securing the large road junction at Mega, which would provide him with a better supply connection back to Kenya. Time was of the essence. In a month, the March rainy season would turn the Chalbi Desert's dusty dirt roads into strips of mud impassable to South African supply trucks. If Brink did not make a breakthrough before the rainy season began, his army would be stranded and vulnerable. With this understanding, Brink began positioning his forces around Mega in early February. This ensured the Italians could not retreat in the coming battle. However, Brink's plans would be discovered when an unsuspecting Italian supply convoy from Yavello toward Mega encountered the 2nd South African Brigade guarding the Yavello-Mega road. While the South Africans managed to capture much of the supply column, the Italians had now discovered Brink's plan. On February 16, 1941, the Italians sent light tanks from Mega to drive off the South African infantry on the Yavello-Mega road. The South Africans were forced to disperse at the sight of the oncoming light tanks, since they had no anti-tank capabilities. Eventually, they reorganized their roadblock once the tanks returned to Mega. The next day, General Brink launched the South African attack on Mega from 3 directions on the 15th. The 1st South African Irish, the 3rd Transvaal Scottish, and the 2nd South African Infantry Brigade all made solid progress against the Mega fort and defensive complex. However, a heavy torrential downpour started at noon, which reduced visibility and stalled the South African attack. The next day, progress was again limited as the rain continued, with thick clouds and fog preventing the South African Air Force from providing any air support. On the 3rd day of the attack, February 18, 1941, the skies cleared, enabling better coordination between South African air support, artillery, and infantry brigades. By late afternoon, the South Africans took control of the fortress, which was notably bigger than the previous outpost they had captured. The fighting in the nearby town of Mega went on for several more days. However, by February 22nd, the last pockets of resistance surrendered, and over 1,000 Italian soldiers were captured. Later that day, elements of the 2nd South African Infantry Brigade advanced to the Ethiopian Kenyan village of Moyale and recaptured Fort Harrington. To their surprise, the Italians had hastily retreated from the fortress, leaving behind large stockpiles of food and ammunition. This retreat reflected the wider collapse of Italian forces in East Africa in February and March of 1941. Fort Harrington was the first fort to fall to the Italians on July 15, 1940. Now, less than a year later, on February 22, 1941, this recapture symbolized the end of Italian occupation in Kenya. Meanwhile, Pienaar's forces captured towns throughout western Somalia in late February and early March. Throughout the rest of March, his forces rapidly drove through southwestern Ethiopia. In the early days of April, the armored cars of Pienaar's 1st South African Infantry Brigade were the first Allied units to enter Addis Ababa on April 5, 1941, and they secured it without a fight, as the Italians had abandoned it and fled north. Pienaar's South Africans fought retreating Italians at the Battle of Kombolsia Pass and Dese, engaging in mountain warfare for the remainder of April. As Pienaar's forces fought the last remnants of the Italian army, General Brink's 2nd and 5th South African Infantry Brigades were preparing to leave East Africa. After the Battle of Mega and the capture of Moyale in late February, General Brink's forces stayed in their positions for a few days before advancing on Yavello and other southern Ethiopian settlements during early March. However, he received news of a potential redeployment to Egypt and began to bring his forces back to the Wajir military base on March 9th. After much waiting, the 2 brigades made their way to Mombasa harbor, leaving for Egypt on April 22, 1941. Back in northern Ethiopia, Pioneer's forces, along with the British, Indian, and the Ethiopians, cornered the Italian viceroy of East Africa, the Duke of Aosta. He and 7,000 troops had fortified themselves in the mountain stronghold of Amba al-Ghali. The battle lasted from May 4th to May 19th. As this battle was ongoing, the Ethiopian government in exile, led by Emperor Haile Selassie, ended their 5-year exile in England and returned to Addis Ababa on May 5th. Meanwhile, the Battle of Amba al-Ghali was still ongoing, and the South Africans had little hope of dislodging the Italians from their mountain stronghold. However, as the days progressed, the Italians ran out of food and water, and they surrendered to the Allied forces on May 19, 1941. This marked the end of significant Italian resistance in East Africa, although some isolated Italian garrisons continued resisting until 1943. After this surrender on May 19th, Pioneer's 1st South African Infantry Brigade was ordered to redeploy to Egypt. They marched north to the Eritrean port of Massawa, where they departed on June 12, 1941, for Egypt. This concludes my summary of South Africa's role in the East African campaign of World War II. While this video did not encompass the entire campaign, I hope you found this history shown from the South African point of view helpful. The East African Campaign is not a well-known aspect of World War II history, so making this video would help fill that gap in understanding. Ultimately, an Italian defeat in East Africa was inevitable. Once the British blocked Italian access to the Suez Canal, Italian East Africa was logistically isolated from mainland Italy. Since the Italian Navy had no hope of effectively escorting convoys beyond the Mediterranean Sea, the amount of supplies that realistically arrived in the ports of Mogadishu and Massawa was tiny. Despite Italy's inability to send reinforcements to East Africa, the 300,000 well-supplied Italian troops already there in 1940 represented a formidable threat to the Allies. Defeating the Italians in East Africa was the first major Allied victory of World War II. It allowed them to focus on securing North Africa and represented the first step toward toppling Italy's fascist dictatorship. Please share your thoughts about my video and the East Africa campaign in the comments below. Is there any point you'd like to make that my video left out? Thank you for watching and have a great day.